Welcome, everybody. This is an exciting day. As part of our AGM, we invited James Shaw to be our guest speaker, which was an incredibly audacious request, especially given that they're having their New Zealand federal election on September the 19th. And he has made time to be with us here today for an hour. So it gives me huge excitement to introduce James Shaw, who is the New Zealand Minister for Climate Change, another drum roll, Minister for Statistics, and another drum roll, Associate Minister for Finance. Prior to becoming an MP, James had a successful career in management consulting, primarily in London, where he lived from 1998 to 2010. He worked with large multinational companies across Europe and around the world, helping them develop more sustainable business practices. While studying in the UK for his master's degree in sustainable development and business leadership, James realized that the private sector alone wasn't able to affect change at the speed and scale necessary to meet the great challenges of our time. James's diverse business experience and expertise, from working for multinational corporates through to local startups, social enterprises, and community organizations, enables him to co-lead the Green Party, the government, and the New Zealanders toward a high-tech, post-carbon economy and society. And our second speaker is Elizabeth May, who needs precious little introduction. As you know, she is Green Party of Canada's first elected member of Parliament, representing Saanich Gulf Islands in southern Vancouver Island. Elizabeth is an environmentalist, writer, activist, lawyer, grandmother, who has a long record as a dedicated advocate for social justice, for the environment, for human rights, and for pragmatic economic solutions. I have asked James and Elizabeth to speak first, and then at approximately 4:30, Dana Taylor from our West Vancouver Sunshine Coast riding will moderate the questions that have been sent in already. And it's possible that James or Elizabeth might address some of the questions as we did give them to them ahead of time. So they might touch on some of those answers already in their presentation. And then between 4:30 and 4:55, as I said, Dana will be presenting the questions that have been sent to us in writing prior to now. And everybody else, feel free to pop questions into the Q&A box, not in the chat box. Let's keep them all in one place. And Dana will then, if there's time, see how many of those questions he can present to James and Elizabeth. And we'll close it up at just before 4 o'clock, and with thanks and appreciation. And away you go, James.
O tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui kia koutou. Good afternoon, and thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to engage in this with you. Canada is one of my favourite places in the world, and so my only real regret about this session is that I'm not able to be with you in person. And it may be some time before I am able to be with you in some person, so I do appreciate the opportunity. And of course, the other opportunity to share a stage with Elizabeth is something that I'll never say no to if I can get the opportunity. So I do take this as a real opportunity. Thank you. And Maureen, thank you for your kind words of introduction there as well. I was asked to speak about the Green Party of New Zealand's experience of being in government and how a small party can help to effect change in a parliament where we're greatly outnumbered. And so just to give you a bit of context, the New Zealand Parliament has 120 members to it. We're a country of 5 million people, and we have a mixed member proportional representation system of government. Now, what that means is that roughly half of the seats that we have are constituency based, like your ridings, and the other half are top-ups using a party list system. And so everybody gets 2 votes. You vote for the person who you want to represent your riding, and you vote for the party that you feel best represents you in Parliament. And what that means, every party gets a share of the seats that is proportional to their nationwide percentage of the vote. So at the last election in 2017, we have a short cycle here. It's only 3 years. So at the last election, the Green Party got 6.2% of the vote, and out of 120 members of Parliament, that means that we have 8 members of Parliament. So we're outnumbered 112 to 8, but conveniently, the Labour Party requires our votes in order to be able to form a majority in Parliament, in government. And so what that means is that we are a part of the government, and as Maureen said, as a result of that, I'm a minister with three portfolios, and I have 3 other colleagues as well, who are members of the executive. One is Julianne Genter, who actually hails from the United States. She is an Associate Minister of Transport. She's also the Minister for Women, and she's an Associate Minister of Health. And Eugenie Sage, who is our Minister for Conservation and is also Associate Minister for the Environment, with particular responsibility for waste management. And I also have another colleague, Jan Logie, who is what we call a Parliamentary Under-Secretary, which is a bit like an Associate Minister. And her responsibilities are in the justice domain, where she has responsibility for our program to reduce domestic and sexual violence. So I'll talk a little bit about those in relation to the things that we are getting done in government. The Green Party has been in Parliament since 1999. So we're 21 years old in Parliament, although we were founded in 1990, and it took us a decade to get into Parliament. And the only reason that we are in Parliament is because of the change to proportional representation in 1996. But this is the first time that we have ever been part of a government. And I have to say that we have done not just more in this 3-year term than the previous, several orders of magnitude more than we were ever able to a position of opposition. And we did do some great things in opposition, and I can talk a little bit about how when you're in a position of opposition, what that means. What are some of the ways that we got, some small wins through. But really, it is a function of being in government. And that's the bit that I'll sort of spend most of my time on. So in coming into government, we were in a position to form a confidence and supply agreement with the Labour Party. There's another party called New Zealand First, who are also in the governmental arrangement. So we have a 3-party coalition that's led by and largely dominated by Labour, because it's so much bigger than either the Greens or New Zealand First. And so in those negotiations, we carved out it's about a 5-page document that's broken up into 3 sections. One is sustainable economy, one is a fair society, and one is healthy nature. And so within each of those 3 sections, there's about half a dozen policy points for things that we said that we wanted to achieve in this 3-year term that the Labour Party agreed, would become part of the program of government. And I'll just talk a wee bit about what some of those things are. So in the domain of a fair society, it covers a very large range of issues, from Indigenous rights through to family reunification for our refugee program, through to an overhaul of our welfare state, which has really fallen into disrepair over the previous 20 to 30 years. And we've gotten a number of significant gains in that area. The primary one actually was in the one that I mentioned before that Jan Logie is responsible for, which is the program on domestic and sexual violence, where Jan has managed to create a cross-government program involving 10 ministers, 10 different government agencies, everyone from social services through to the police, to develop a sort of a whole of government program and response, which has been held up as a real example of good government here in New Zealand. But we haven't gotten everything that we wanted to when we negotiated that agreement. Most particularly, one of the things that happened was we got a review of our of our welfare system, which pointed out everything that we actually knew, which is that it's had many holes poked in it, and a lot of people are falling through that safety net. But unfortunately, we were unable to persuade our government partners to do more than really the minimum to sort of patch things up. So that will be something that we take into the next election. In the second area, which is around healthy nature, that's primarily in the domain of conservation and the conservation estate. Again, that's been an area where I think that we've done even better than we thought we would when we were negotiating the agreement. And probably the signature piece of that is that as a result of the post-COVID stimulus program, we're spending 1.3 billion New Zealand dollars on a Jobs for Nature program, which is to soak up some of the spike in unemployment that we're seeing as a result of the economic downturn from the pandemic, and putting people to work, either planting up native trees, which help to form carbon sinks, to put riparian planting strips along waterways, which helps to reduce nitrogen runoff from our dairy farms, to take out wilding pines, which are an introduced species in New Zealand that have a tendency to cause havoc with our indigenous forests, and on predator eradication. So we have a number of introduced species here like rats and stoats, possums, and so on, that also cause significant damage to our indigenous flora and fauna. And so we're looking at employing somewhere between 11 and 13,000 people over the next 4 years on those things. And just for a sense of scale, New Zealand, by the way, has a population of about 5 million, and our unemployment rate is currently at about somewhere between 7 and 8% as a result of the COVID crisis. So, a few tens of thousands of jobs makes quite a significant difference to that. But we've also had, in that domain, a number of other wins and so on. So we're feeling quite good about that area. And the third section was on a sustainable economy, and primarily what that means is a zero carbon economy, which is the area that I've been primarily responsible for in my time. And the main things that we did there is we passed in Parliament a Zero Carbon Act, which puts in place a legal requirement for New Zealand to live within the threshold of 1.5 degrees of global warming above pre-industrial levels, and then a series of emissions reductions targets like getting to net zero for long-lived gases like carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide by 2050, and a reduction in our flow of methane into the atmosphere over that period of time. Significant changes to the way that our transport system works, because carbon dioxide from transport emissions is our single largest growing area, and also the one in many ways that's easiest to do something about because of the availability of electric and hydrogen vehicles and so on. And so we've spent much of the last 3 years really putting in place the institutional frameworks, setting up a politically independent climate change commission to advise the government, reforming our emissions trading scheme, which had significant holes in it. It was a cap and trade system with no cap, and what that meant is that whilst there was a price applied, emissions were effectively unlimited. And so what we've done is we've put a volumetric cap in place on that, which is set at this year's levels, and then will reduce every year from now until 2050 once we've eliminated CO2 entirely. So that's been a major reform program, but it hasn't actually yet started to reduce emissions. Of course, these things take time to take effect, but we also know that we need to do not just those high-level settings, but get into the real machinery of the economy, and to work directly with the energy sector, the transport sector, building and construction, agriculture, and so on. And to me, that's really what the next term is going to be about, assuming that we're in a position to be able to form a government again after the election. So I guess the reason why I'm telling you all of this is because if you're lucky, like we were in 2017, and you're in a position where you have the ability to negotiate to form a government, my advice would be go into government don't choose to sit on the sidelines, even though it will come at some cost. You know, you will have to make decisions that compromise your positions kind of every week. But the net result is you can do great things in a way that you never can if you don't have your hands on the machinery of government. But there's a moment of leverage that you have, and I know that I learned a lot of things as a result of those negotiations in 2017. Some of which I would repeat, some of which I would never do again if I have the choice, and a lot of which is I've learned, you know, as a result of what happens after you finish the negotiations. But you do have a moment there where you can get some significant things. And my advice is always to say, what are the 3 big things that you want, and be really focused on those. Get those in writing, that the other parties in your government have to support those things, and negotiate whatever else you can as well, but really make sure that you've got 3 key things that are going to make a long-term difference on the challenges that you face in areas that speak to the Green Party's core values and vision for the country. The other thing is that, you know, I think it was General Patton who said, no plan survives first contact with the enemy. So what I noticed is that your plan holds for about the first 6 months of government, and then, you know, events happen, and you kind of just have to work with what you've got. You also learn things as you go, and so you know, things that you thought were a good idea in the negotiations may actually turn out in hindsight not to be, once you actually kind of learn a bit more about the domain. But also you want to be able to tack and change with new circumstances or new information. And to me, that's really about the nature of being in government and the quality of the relationships that you have with your partners in government, where, you know, and this was difficult for us because we had quite an awkward relationship with the Labour Party prior to 2017. We now have a very trusted relationship with the Labour Party, and we've come to know each other a lot better. But it really is the quality of those relationships, given the power imbalance, because they have so many more MPs than we do. They hold the Prime Ministership, they hold the Minister of Finance. And so for us to kind of get everything in a situation where it's not written down in advance does come down to the quality of the relationship that we have. And that's been a very difficult balance for us to navigate, between needing to speak up in public on the issues that are important to us and where we do hold a different view from the Labour Party, but at the same time needing to maintain that trusted relationship with them in order to be able to get the gains through that we've been able to get through. The last thing I just want to say is, and that's sort of brings me to the point about what can you do when you're in opposition, and we did get things through. We got a home insulation scheme that we actually negotiated with our Conservative Party when they were in government about 10 years ago. That's been astonishingly successful. We also negotiated with them a nationwide system of bicycle trail routes as a proposition for tourism and long-range cycling and so on. And various changes to a million pieces of legislation, as well as private members' bills that our MPs would put up that got pulled out of the ballot and that went into Parliament. And we got a few things through, including a Waste Minimisation Act that we're now putting to good use in government. But again, because we were in opposition, mostly we were able to get those things because of the way that we treated the other parties in Parliament. And I know, because I know Elizabeth well, that you've had a very strong line on, whilst speaking up for your values, you never engage in personal attacks, even when members of other political parties are busy digging holes for themselves, and always treat everybody with dignity and with respect, because when you can do that, and it comes for free, you know, treating people well as a renewable resource, you actually find that gets returned to you, even from people who you might have in private a pretty dim opinion with. And so I would say that, to me, is one of the key things that the Greens have been able to be successful both in opposition and in government, because we choose to do politics in a way that's different from the way that it's usually practiced, and that those other practitioners of politics actually respond quite well to that for the most part. So that's where we're at, and I obviously will turn it over to Elizabeth now for her commentary, but I do want to say that I wish you all the very best of luck. I was over in Canada a few years ago at Elizabeth's invitation at your national convention, and we were talking then about the Fair Vote program, because I do think, looking at Canada's experience, it's very similar to New Zealand's. Until you get proportional representation, the Greens are always going to struggle to be represented in Parliament, either at the state or province level or at the federal level. And to me, that's your kind of first best battle to be won. Kia ora koutou.
Thank you, James. You do have 5 more minutes, and I'm wondering if you could address what influence the 8 Green MPs had in the way the government successfully managed the pandemic. I know that you're an island. I know that you're a smaller population, et cetera, but what influence did the Greens have?
Yeah, there's some parts of that story I can never tell. So the pandemic response was driven by the Prime Minister, and that's appropriate. But because I'm a member of the executive, I was involved, and because it is a 3-party coalition, we set up a group of ministers, which is a subcommittee of cabinet, which was called the Ad Hoc Cabinet Committee on COVID-19, and it had 7 members, seven ministers on it, of whom I was one. Really, the primary purpose there was to provide that link back to the Green Party caucus, so that the Prime Minister could know that she had, all 3 parties of government on board as we step through the response. I didn't have specific responsibilities in there. Most of those went to, there are some ministers whose portfolios were very busy. The Minister of Education had to work out how to close down schools, but, continue home-based education. Minister for Social Development had to start pumping out money to businesses as a wage subsidy in less than a week from the point that Cabinet made the decision. Minister of Health obviously was extremely busy managing the kind of direct health, public health system response. Minister of Finance was turning on the taps and fire hosing money into the economy to keep it going as we were closing down. Minister for Climate Change didn't have so much to do, and that was directly COVID related. Although there are kind of issues that I had to handle, like some companies have emissions trading scheme obligations that they weren't able to fulfill for that period of time, and so we just had to manage how we were going to deal with that. So those sort of issues. However, as a member of the executive, my specific portfolios aside, I was very involved in trying to influence the cabinet to get to the decision to go to total lockdown, because the situation that we were in is that we knew quite early on in February that uncontrolled community transmission in New Zealand would be an absolute disaster for us. We simply did not have the health system capability to deal with a kind of a mass infection rate like we were seeing in other countries around the world. And we also didn't have very good data on the spread of COVID-19 in New Zealand. And we were seeing some results come through from other countries about the exponential rate of increase of community transmission. And one of the charts that I saw suggested that once you have 9 cases of community, on average, countries that had 9 cases of community transmission, that was the tipping point. And then 4 weeks later, you would have thousands, or 2 weeks later, you would have thousands because of the exponential rate of increase. And that was sort of a key piece of information to get in front of the cabinet to say, look, the safest route is to shut the country, close the borders and send everyone home for 28 days, which is 2 full cycles of incubation, because, in the absence of anything else, that was the least worst option. And ultimately it seems to have paid off.
Congratulations. Yes. Elizabeth, over to you.
Well, it's not surprising to the participants on this call. Every sweet and complimentary thing that James just said about me, I feel tenfold about him. So I want to start by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you today from the territory of the Algonquin peoples. I'm here in Ottawa, the Algonquin Nation, but I have to also, I'm compelled to raise my hands to everyone and the territorial acknowledgement of the Wasanuk people of my constituency in Saanich Gulf Islands and Sehishka Siam. It's a fascinating thing, and my favorite thing really about being in the Green Party of Canada is the connection we have to global Greens. We learn so much from each other, and I would, as James sketched it out, of course we know our situation, where you've got that 8 MPs and 100 and some opposition to you in theory. There's 3 of us and 335 of the others, but I think MP for MP, we have a much bigger impact than other much bigger parties, and that's really because Paul Manley, MP for Nanaimo Ladysmith, and by the way, James and I first met virtually in a press conference we did in the 2015 election, when Paul was running first in Nanaimo Ladysmith. We did a press conference together on the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So we first met with like this on screens. Well, anyway, and so we've known each other a while, but the ability to work across, to work globally, to think globally, to say, well, here's some solutions to investor state agreements, here's some solutions, and we've worked together a lot. One of the reasons that James and I see each other more than I see other Greens globally is that as Minister of Climate, and I tend to go to the conferences of the parties, I can tell you James has made a huge difference as Minister of Climate, taking on every COP since he's been in that role, really a leadership role within COP, and in Madrid, designated as the person to handle the stickiest file in the room. So days on end, I'm sure he didn't get any sleep at all. Anyway, what we learn from each other is, and I'm really thinking about this a lot, confidence and supply agreements and watching out for your partners. We're in a first past the post system. And we are, as Canadian Greens, of all the countries in the world still stuck with first past the post, we've done better than any other Green Party anywhere in the world stuck with first past the post. We have to get past it. It would be fantastic to have a fair voting system. But I'm worried. I know that we are having right now, James, there's not only a leadership race to replace me at the federal level, there's a leadership race with the BC Greens. And we need to really figure out in terms of how do you strategize when you've been in a confidence and supply agreement. Now, in your case, thank the Lord, people know I can still vote Green and I can still keep Jacinda Ardern as my Prime Minister. As a matter of fact, James, actually, if most Canadians could vote right now to replace all of us with Jacinda Ardern, they would do so. They would just jump at it. So, and I know that your role, that you have a good working relationship with her, made all the difference in getting a Climate Accountability Act through in New Zealand, which had every single party in Parliament, including the right-wingers, on board, because you got that commitment early from everybody to have government form. I think, personally, I think that the NDP in British Columbia, absolutely, they may have stuck with the letter of the agreement on confidence and supply, but they violated the spirit of it as much as they were possibly able to. And we'll be going into an election in BC, who knows for sure, but we have to make sure that we hold the beachhead that we have in Oak Bay, Gordon Head, and in Adams Seat in North Saanich, and Sonia Furstenau, and whoever else runs for leadership, we have to get them elected. We have to really work hard, because I know what happened with the Irish Greens. I got to know Kieran Cuffe quite well when he was Minister of Environment and Climate back at the time of the Copenhagen negotiations. I don't know if you ever got to know Kieran Cuffe, James, but he's a lovely guy. And the Irish Greens stayed in their support coalition too long, and then they got wiped out because they'd been seen to be part of a government that wasn't popular, even though their role was so minimal. So I think all of us as Greens, federal or provincial, wherever we're from, we have to figure out that strategy. So any advice you have, James, on how you deal with it in the first past the post system, having been in a confidence supply agreement, what do you do when you're reoffering? For us as federal Greens, we've got, I think we can hold our space and continue to do well because we've held our space in Parliament with the three of us there. We've been very effective, although we can't claim credit. Just as you said, you can't ever tell us some of the stories of what you did in pandemic. I can't tell some of the stories of what we did in pandemic. I'm absolutely certain that we prevented billions of dollars going to fossil fuel bailouts. I'm quite confident that the advice that we were giving around, look at this over here, how we bail out orphan wells. Oh, I got diverted. As soon as I went down memory lane to talk about you and me and Paul Manley doing a press conference, I have to also say our third MP, Jenica Atwin from Fredericton, New Brunswick, is spectacular. And so she's made a big difference because the other MPs listen to her when she speaks. So the three of us, we are a small caucus, but we have really good teamwork. And I think we're holding our ground. And then you have to build up from there and figure out where do we elect? Who else can we elect? But we're looking at a post-pandemic situation where it's totally unpredictable what's going to happen in terms of do we get another. We're not out of the woods the way New Zealand is. Our Parliament could not meet safely right now, no matter what the Conservatives say. It would not be safe for us to have physical meeting of the full Parliament, and the Conservatives are blocking us being able to go to virtual voting, which the BC legislature is already doing. So we're in a world of a lot of as Greens, I'm absolutely committed that the next leader pick up where I left off and we elect more people. That's critical. The country needs us to elect more people. The planet needs us to elect more people. But we're going to be up against political headwinds of a disastrously unpopular, which is fine. I'm happy that the Conservatives are disastrously unpopular. They deserve to be disastrously unpopular. But the first past the post system is going to be challenging for us to be able to say to voters, look at this, don't worry. This is the election of elections where there's no chance of the Conservatives forming government. Again, people are not going to be going to be voting Conservative. This is the election to convince people that even if you liked Justin Trudeau and how the Liberals handled pandemic, you know you need Greens in Parliament. They wouldn't have done nearly as good a job but for three Green MPs who were continually helpful, provided good advice. Well, I'm not quite sure what the next leader will say or do in terms of how we message why people need to elect more Greens. But in terms of the climate emergency, we can't risk any loss of seats for sure. We have to elect a lot more people, and we have to do it provincially and federally. And I noticed as I scrolled through participants, not surprisingly, and I should thank West Vancouver, Sunshine Coast, Sea to Sky Country, EDA, and Maureen in particular for putting this together. But we have a lot of British Columbians on this webinar. We have to, as federal Greens, be prepared to go full bore to help the British Columbia Greens whenever an election comes. And if our election federally comes first, the reverse applies. We have to make sure we get as many Greens elected as possible right across Canada. And the benefits that are visible are, we've passed legislation as Greens federally. We've done a lot to affect policies as Greens federally. But I think what a lot of Canadians appreciate is where James ended, so I'll end on the same point. Canadians appreciate people who are willing to be collaborative across party lines and at least respectful towards others, no matter how difficult certain people may make it to remain respectful. But there's no ad hominem attacks against anyone coming from the Green Party. And I think voters appreciate it, and I know that it makes it much easier to be effective in Parliament when people think, oh gee, it's something the Green Party wants. I suppose we should do that because it must be a high-minded, thoughtful, evidence-based idea because it's coming from the Greens. And I'll close there.
Elizabeth, over to you, Dana, with your questions from written questions and from today.
Well, I mute myself. Good, thank you very much. First of all, Maureen, to check in with you, how much time do we have?
We have 20 minutes.
Okay, good. As might be expected, many of the questions that came in are first and foremost addressed to our guests from New Zealand. So let me begin with one, not to exclude you, Elizabeth, there will be opportunities, I'm sure, too. One of the questions is, and it speaks to the whole issue of proportional representation. And the question is, how can Greens more effectively promote electoral reform to achieve a more representative electoral system, such as proportional representation? And James, if I may add to that too, a corollary that in circumstances, I think contribute a lot, I'm guessing contribute a lot to the New Zealand experience. If you could comment on how maybe those coincided in order to assist, now that we have them, Greens to help promote electoral reform here in Canada. Any suggestions? What do you say?
There was a particular moment in New Zealand history that led to bringing in proportional representation. So it actually goes back to the late 70s and early 80s. We had a very authoritarian conservative prime minister who ran probably the most closed socialist economy outside of the Soviet Union, which is confusing to most people, right? So you had a right-wing prime minister running a very command and control type economy. There was an election in 1984 when the Conservative Party was ejected and the Labour Party came in, and of course, and they were kind of a left-wing government who put in place things like homosexual law reform and the banning of nuclear ships in our waters and those kinds of things. They also ran the most liberal economic policy for any country outside of Singapore. And so you had a left-wing government implementing neoliberal reforms, and it was a massive period of economic reform in our economy, much of which was necessary because of the way that the economy had been run previously, and we were on the verge of bankruptcy in 1984. But what happened was an enormous amount of social dislocation, and unemployment above 10%, which hasn't happened since, and all sorts of things. And so it was, I mean, frankly, half the country has still got post-traumatic stress syndrome from the 1980s. And then what happened, as we said, is we booted them out in 1990, and the Conservatives came back in, but by then they had gone even more right-wing than the Labour Party. And so we got more of the same, of that neoliberal economic reform. And so what happened was you had a significant breakdown in trust in the two main parties, because it was sort of seen that they were both inflicting a level of pain on the country, and that led to a social backlash. And the kind of the phrase was, well, a pox on both your houses. And so the conditions were set for a change in the voting system because it was seen as a way of controlling or limiting the power that those two parties had. And in a moment of weakness, the Conservative Prime Minister at the time promised a referendum on proportional representation, which he then campaigned against and lost. And so at that time, the kind of the social conditions were there for a change. And the way that the Greens operated within that was we campaigned for electoral reform, but actually a lot of our people went and joined a non-partisan campaign group called the Electoral Reform Coalition. And I think that was seen as important, that the people who were pushing for reform weren't political parties, because the political parties look self-interested, obviously, like, hey, get democratic reform and get us, So the guy that led the Electoral Reform Coalition, as soon as the referendum was won, he joined the Green Party and became the co-leader of the Green Party. So he had my job. His name was Rod Donald. That's kind of the history of how we came to have proportional representation.
Good, thank you.
Can I ask, Dana, I know I'm not allowed to do this, but I'm dying to do this. We have a leadership race, and some of the scuttlebutt that pops up on Facebook groups, and it's been a live conversation with Canadian Greens for a long time, is should we move to a co-leader situation? The UK went from Carolyn Lucas as the sole leader, and then they went to co-leadership, and you have always been in the co-leader situation. It's just something that I wonder if you feel comfortable sharing a view for a lot of Canadian Greens who are interested in the concept, how well it works, and whether, I mean, you might not want to say whether you personally want to keep it or not because you're in it, but it would be, I think we'd all like to know what it's like.
Coincidentally, that was my next question, Elizabeth. So there.
Yeah. So
that was very
think about Elizabeth. She's always just slightly ahead of the curve. So the way that I would describe it is, which set of problems would you rather have, right? Because I don't think that there is a perfect model of leadership. You know, having a kind of a traditional leader deputy, the advantages of that are that you can have a speed of decision making and a strategic coherence that you sometimes don't have when you've got a co-leadership situation. The disadvantage is that the strategic direction may swing more with a leader-deputy model, depending on who the leader is, right? I mean, I certainly noticed that with other political parties here in the New Zealand Parliament, which have got a traditional leader-deputy model, is when the new leader comes in, that signifies a change of direction for the party. And one of the strengths of the New Zealand Green Party is we have been stable and consistent the entire time. Now, the disadvantage of the co-leader model is that it makes it very difficult to have big changes of direction when you need them. And because generally what happens is, so we have a, it's a gender balanced, male, female, which I have to say these days comes with its own set of issues because of changing views of gender and so on. So there is now a live conversation about that dimension to it. But also people tend to factor in, they tend to say not only do they need to be gender balanced, we also need to be balanced in other ways, right? So if there is a Māori, an Indigenous candidate, that's important to balance the fact that I'm not. There's a sort of ongoing balance in the party with people who have got sort of more kind of socialist leanings versus, kind of nature first type leanings. And so, people tend to see that represented, and so on. And that helps in some ways because you then do have this kind of balanced leadership, but it does mean that you can get periods of indecision when you need decisiveness. And so, I don't think there's any appetite in New Zealand for us to change the model, but you have to be aware that whatever model you choose to have will have its limits. And you can have situations where people will elect a co-leader and the two don't get on. And that can make life very difficult, not just for those two people, but actually for the whole party, because then things just get stuck because the two of them cancel each other out. So, that I would just say, don't go into either model or any model with rose-tinted glasses. Just be really aware that whatever you do, there will be some advantages and some disadvantages, and you've got to balance those things out against each other.
Good, thank you. I have a question here about Project Drawdown and how that might link with Greens. I presume you're aware of, very much so. And the question is, how might governments best foster the implementation of these solutions in Project Drawdown? And how might Green Party candidates and members best utilize the influence of an organization like this, assuming that it chooses to remain non-partisan?
I've got 2 copies on my shelf, and they're heavily marked up. But they are global. And so the first thing that you need to do is to work out what's going to make the biggest, of all of those things, what's going to make the biggest difference in your area. And that will come down to local ecological conditions and economic kind of conditions. So, for example, we know that the countries that have had the most success in decarbonising their economies have done so by taking their old coal-fired power plants offline and replacing them with, in some cases, gas turbines or large-scale offshore wind and solar and so on. In New Zealand, we have one coal-fired power plant, which, emissions from electricity generation are only 4% of our total. For us, transport is the most important thing. So that says, because transport makes up a quarter of our total emissions profile and it's growing, whereas everything else is either steady or starting to decline. So you have to adapt to that. The other thing, of course, is it has sort of global lessons, and it talks a lot about soil sequestration, for example. But in New Zealand, our soil conditions, we actually already have high carbon soils, and so anything that we do from Project Drawdown for soil sequestration would actually only make a marginal difference in our soil conditions as compared to, say, Australia, which is largely a desert, and where those kind of things that they're talking about would make a massive difference. So you've got to work out what local conditions mean. As Elizabeth said, you work out the thing that develop a sense of priority. How do you get the most megatons of reduction for the dollar spent? And again, for us, we know that it'll cost less per ton of CO2 to change our vehicle fleet than it will to do just about anything else in there. So that gives you a sense of timing of which you would put things in, because you can't do everything. And the final thing, which is something that we're only just getting started with, but which the UK has 10 years of experience with, is to have an independent climate change commission that does emissions budgeting. And essentially what that budgeting gives you is a sense of both top-down what's required, but also bottom-up what is actually technologically and economically possible in any given 5-year period, and a sense of, therefore, where should you devote your policy attention to. And you've kind of got, you've really got about 3 or 4 options. You can regulate, you can spend taxpayer money and invest directly, and you can educate, any policy mix that you do sort of comes down to some version of those three things.
Good, thank you. I had a typical question, and you probably encountered it elsewhere too, but from one of our members, describes themselves as a longtime NDP or Labour, in your equivalent, that has a view that impression of the Green Party being economically conservative. And the question would be, if it's the case, so how do Greens in either Canada or New Zealand square supporting an fiscal conservatism with making progress on social justice and economic equality issues?
I would be so happy if, and I know I'm glad someone asked the question. I mean, I'd be so happy if I could figure out how to stop this lie. And of course, it's just a lie. There's no point saying it's a misunderstanding. There's no point saying, well, you can read that into our policies. You can't. I got an NDP flyer through my mail slot in my own home, James, saying that if we were ever able to influence government, we would insist on austerity programs to balance a budget. The fact that we prefer to balance budget if we can doesn't mean, I stood up in front of the media today. We had our economic update from the Minister of Finance. We're going to run a deficit this year of $343 billion, and we just broke through $1 trillion in debt. And I stood in front of the media and said, and we need to spend more. We can't stop spending, or we're going to go into a deep depression, and we need to look at modern monetary theory, and we need to stop being beholden to the big Canadian banks. I don't know, but you can hear the exasperation in my voice. This has been going on for years. Now, of course, you got to have a good relationship with Labour once you got out of first past the post. But I will say that probably the answer to the question, how do we stop having people lie about the Green Party and where we stand on this issue, will be when we get some form of proportional representation where the NDP no longer has the incentive to lie about us, because I'm sure Labour used to lie about you guys.
Yeah, so I have to say that the relationship that we have with the Labour Party is good now that we are in government together. but prior to that, there was a kind of sibling rivalry, shall we say, because we were essentially competing from the same pool of votes, which is your kind of broadly left, centre-left kind of pool. And because they had, been one of the two parties under first past the post, there was typically the older generation of Labour politicians and supporters resented losing any of that voter pool to the Green Party, even though, in electoral terms, you would add the Green vote to the Labour vote in order to be able to form a government. So from a kind of overall system perspective, there was no loss. But to any one party, it feels like you're losing votes to a rival party. And so that did induce some unhelpful behaviour, and there was a kind of a lack of trust between the two parties. And I have to say there were periods of time that the Greens were responsible for part of that, because some of the people who came to the Greens came to us because we were a reaction to that period in the 1980s, and they had a deep mistrust of Labour's kind of right-wing neoliberal history. Now, I think that Jacinda and the current generation of Labour politicians has put paid to that, for the most part, not entirely, but for the most part. And they can see that people see that we work well together, and actually we can both do well when we're collaborating. So that it's, in relationship status terms, it's complicated, and personality has quite a lot to do with it, and history has a lot to do with it. And as Elizabeth says, I'm not sure that you can do anything to stop other parties from lying. All you can do is stand up and tell your truth, to the extent that you can.
Yeah, and sorry for saying lying. That seemed really unkind towards the people who were lying, but I just am up to here with it.
Yeah.
Good to the people who are lying. We're getting close to the top of the hour. Do we have time for one more question? Maureen?
Yes, go for it.
Okay, I said I'm going to get more into a question. I'm sorry, we have a number of questions piled up, but let me try this one because I know it applies to Canada and New Zealand on a specific issue, and that is what the Green Party's experience in either New Zealand or Canada in terms of of policies, projects, and legislation to ensure the tourism sector grows in a responsible way. And we're talking strictly green here. Go ahead, James or Elizabeth.
I'll jump in because I came from a tourism family background on Cape Breton Island, and I'm a huge promoter of tourism, and I've been working really hard to promote Canadian tourism sector shifting to low carbon tourism, which means much more. I mean, actually the pandemic is making this happen, is lots more explore your own country first. I mean, James knows I won't say dying to, I would dearly love to go to New Zealand. It's beautiful. I'd love to see my friends in the New Zealand Greens, but I will never fly there because, unless it's for some urgent work reason, because of the carbon footprint. But there's, the train across Canada is a spectacular thing to do. And basically in Canada, the total amount of money spent, Canadians spending money overseas is, as a dollar figure amount, much larger than the foreign tourists spending money in Canada. So if we were to look at that and say, keeping Canadians home and spend your money here, and once the train's not going to run again till November, but once we get past that obstacle, bring your bicycle on board the train, or as some of my friends do, put your canoe in the baggage car and ask to get off in Armstrong and canoe into the wilderness. We have an opportunity for low carbon tourism, and we actually need to work on it and perfect it.
Great. Thanks, Elizabeth. James.
Well, this is a very live question in New Zealand, because up until February, tourism was the #1 foreign export earner of any sector in the country, and now it earns nil because there are no tourists coming to New Zealand from offshore. Now, our tourism sector, about 60% of all revenue was actually domestic tourism. So, and that obviously 100% of tourism is now domestic. But what's interesting, of course, is that New Zealanders, because we don't have any restrictions in New Zealand, we're currently in school holidays, and Air New Zealand domestically is busier than it has ever been. And that's because New Zealanders are not going to the Cook Islands or to Australia, or sadly to Vancouver for holidays. And so actually there is some balancing, but it is highly damaging for us in a sort of a pure economic sense. However, we were struggling with a low value mass market proposition, where we were struggling to contain the environmental effects of tourism in New Zealand. And something that I'm really proud of that we got through in the first year that we were in government was an international visitor levy. So of $25. So anybody who was coming into New Zealand would pay an additional $25, and that money would go to the conservation estate to help with predator control and conservation efforts, which is why 80% of people come to New Zealand. Like, they come to visit the conservation estate. And so that did two things. It had a marginally limiting effect on numbers. So we're seeing sort of less rapid growth in the volume, but it also meant that we were actually getting more value out of the people who were coming. And that money was actually going into the very thing that people were coming here for. Now, obviously, revenue from that is currently also at nil because no one's coming right now. But the tourism sector did have a strategy of moving from volume to value. And because we are in this hiatus at the moment of enforced no volume and no value, that we actually have the opportunity to retool the tourism sector so that as things start to recover, it starts with a high value but low volume proposition. And actually, because the most likely thing for the next week or next year or two will be that anybody who comes here is going to have to spend 2 weeks in isolation in a nice hotel, the tourism proposition changes quite a lot. So instead of, short trips, the model will be come here for a long time, spend a couple of weeks in a nice hotel and then go see the country for 6 months. And that will only apply to a small number of people, but for greater value. And whether or not, you think that's a good idea, it's probably the only way in a post-COVID world that we're going to be able to have any tourism sector at all. So the sector's going through massive change right now. And finally, I will say that we are putting quite a lot of effort, and Air New Zealand has been putting quite a lot of effort into working out what to do about airline emissions, because as an island in the South Pacific, you just can't get anywhere from here without taking an aeroplane. And you can't get to here from anywhere without taking an aeroplane either. And so Air New Zealand has been putting quite a lot of effort into things like research into electric aeroplanes, which within 10 years we'll have in our small domestic routes. Take a lot longer to do the long haul international for that, and so on. And quite a lot of the forestry plantation that's going on in New Zealand is aviation offset forestry. So, that's kind of getting us through, muddling through the short term.
Good.
Thank you.
Thank you, James. Thank you, James and Elizabeth, and apologies to those who had questions that didn't get answered. I'll turn it back to you, Maureen, to do the wrap. But Elizabeth, James, very nice. Thanks for sharing.
Just want to say what a joy it was to share the program with you, James, and all the best for the election campaign. And if Canadians can do anything to help, let us know. You're one of the most inspiring green leaders on the planet. Thank you.
Well, coming from you, Elizabeth, that's you're making me flush. I don't know if you can see that on the camera, but I can certainly feel it. Thank you. And if you know any Kiwis, please ask them to vote Green at the election.
Will do.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you both. I have two closing points. One is that, and I picked this up from a New Zealander who suggested that they could help salvage the tourist industry by offering quarantine tourism in New Zealand that would basically be putting people up in their very own private hobbit house for as long as for 2 weeks minimum and longer. Anyway, you can throw that in the mix. The second thought that occurs to me is, given that it is your election coming up, it could behoove Canadian Greens to, in fact, try to campaign virtually for you. I know some of us signed up to help the Bernie Sanders campaign, and so we could support you, and we could also learn directly from some of the techniques that you're using. Especially with pandemic, we will be looking at more and more virtual kinds of campaigning. So I will certainly encourage people in my riding to pitch in really significantly to help your campaign, because what New Zealand is doing is such an inspiration to us as Greens and to the rest of the world. Thank you, everybody. Thank you to all the attendees. Thank you to Josh and the interpreter. And I hope we can do this again, maybe in a year. Goodbye, everybody.